Hey guys, my name is Chris Aniszczyk. Hopefully you can hear me back there. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of Twitter's attitudes kind of towards open source, a little kind of history around the company, kind of, because that kind of influences our attitude, and kind of we'll dive in a little bit about kind of how we handle compliance at Twitter, and also some kind of lessons we learned over the years dealing with that problem. So I always love an agenda, and also I'm super informal, so if you guys have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I will gladly stop and we could answer it. So agendas are always good, so I'll start a little history around the company, so kind of how it got started, because that does kind of influence how we operate today. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the philosophy and culture that we defined at Twitter regarding open source. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we deal with compliance, our attitudes towards it, and some of the logistics we have in place to deal with it. And then I'll kind of wrap things up with some lessons learned over the years at Twitter, and then kind of wrap things up with a Q&A if anyone has any other questions. So I hopefully don't need to explain what Twitter is, so hopefully you guys understand. There's many ways to think about it. Some people think of it as like IRC for the masses, but in the essence, it's just like a real-time public distributed system out there to connect people with ideas and other things. But it started in 2006. It was this kind of a very stupid, simple idea that basically people wanted to broadcast their status messages, right? Very, very simple concept. And at that time, the software stack to run this was also very simple. So a long time ago, Twitter was just a simple Rails app with a bunch of Memcache and MySQL. It's changed a lot since then. If in the beginning we had a shit ton of problems dealing with Rails and scaling it. So there's a lot of fail whales, which now you shouldn't see too much. So I think that's kind of gone away. But to get a context of how much kind of growth that we had to deal with over time is, I joined a few years ago. There was a lot of ramp up in employees. So anytime you're kind of scaling an organization, you have to deal with some interesting challenge, and it's definitely kind of affected our attitudes towards open source. Time kept passing. 2010, we also had a bunch of kind of issues with scalability. When the World Cup was happening, anytime someone scored a goal or there was a red card, it was servers would go down. It was bad. So eventually, I'm not going to dive into details, but we kind of re-architected Twitter to be a little bit more service oriented and moved off from Rails to the JVM, and we're all kind of happy now. So that's about as much technical details you're going to get today for the talk. But if you're interested, we could always chat offline about that. So things kept growing. Tons of tweets per day. Here's kind of the more important slide is, so we're at about 2,000 plus people, globally. Half of those are engineers, and that's going to kind of play into kind of our view in open source. Support a ton of languages. We got about 100% or 100 plus open source projects out there that we kind of deal with. But so that's nice. How does our attitude towards open source kind of fit in this? So, like I mentioned, half the company was engineers, and even earlier on, more so than half. So, in the beginning, a lot of kind of attitudes towards open source were like, hey, the stuff is there, let's just use it and kind of not care about anything, not really worry about legal issues per se. Let's use what we can and get the service kind of running. Let's open up stuff that we've kind of developed too. So what happened when I joined was there was a ton of kind of code dumping, I'll say. So engineers were just throwing stuff on GitHub, hey, here's some code, no license, no anything. It was just out there. Sometimes it didn't build, but there was all the problems. But I actually didn't feel, or actually the other worst thing that they were doing, they were also leaking private IPs and passwords and other bad things. But that happens. But I actually didn't feel so bad about this when this happened, because if you recall, GitHub enabled search across all the repositories one time, and that was bad. people were finding SSH keys, all that wonderful stuff out there. So I didn't feel too bad when that kind of happened. I'm like, yeah, mistakes happen. So essentially, this was a problem where we didn't really have anyone that owned, open source at Twitter. So I kind of came on board and established an open source office. We were getting, oddly enough, lawyers like to send out cease and desist letters, so we're getting some of those there. So we essentially got things started by establishing a group of people that are especially responsible towards Twitter's open source practices. And one of the first things that we actually had to do was to actually define, what our attitude and kind of, philosophy is towards open source at Twitter. So this is kind of one of the first exercises that I had to accomplish at Twitter, and it essentially kind of boiled down into these kind of characteristics, which I'll kind of talk to in a little bit. But I'm actually kind of proud of this because it actually does fit in a tweet. So if you actually try to count those up, it actually does fit within the context of Twitter. So the first kind of principle that we have is, internally, we tend to default towards using open source technology. So, it's not a surprise to a lot of you, especially if you've been in the industry for a while, but we essentially, before we kind of go down the road of reinventing the wheel or hey, trying our hand at recreating a distributed key value store, we force teams to kind of benchmark against what's out there. If they want to create something, go for it. But if you're actually going to try to reuse it in production, please benchmark it against in the distributed key value store case, you have Redis and Voldemort and other stuff out there. So, the philosophy is that just use what's out there. If you could beat it, great. So, as a result of this policy, pretty much the majority of Twitter stack is all on open source stuff. There's very few things that I would consider proprietary outside of our kind of ad server and some of our serving infrastructure there. The next kind of principle that we ran within our engineering organization was kind of, we want to open up a lot of things, and part of doing that is you kind of have to define what your secret sauce is as a company, right? Once you kind of define that, you kind of easily could tell what you could open and what you can't. And within Twitter's case, we're essentially a service provider company, right? So we provide a service. It happens to be free. Basically, the way Twitter makes money is mostly in two ways. You have advertising, which you've probably seen somewhat, and also we have a licensing business for data. So things that we kind of consider IP generally go anything related to our ads advertising system. So, but everything else is kind of fair game. So when you set it up that way, it becomes a little bit easier to define what you open. And so if you know your secret sauce, it's pretty easy to decide what you want to open. And one just simple example from us is a long time ago. A couple engineers came up to me and was like, hey, we want to open source our Blueprint front end framework, right? And I'm a back end engineer. I don't really get the front end stuff. I was like, cool. It's kind of shipping down the wire anyway. So we're like, all right, do it. And that project eventually became Bootstrap, and it's ridiculous how popular one small little act that we did. And then we ended up also opening the majority of our kind of front end stuff because that stuff was already coming down the wire. Just happened to be mostly minified. So the other thing that we kind of another principle is so we kind of force people on the inside to basically develop like they were working in open source land. So what's interesting about this approach is basically it forces us to be careful about what we use and depend on. So we basically, if you guys are familiar with the Apache kind of third-party dependency guidelines, we essentially use or inspired by those and kind of use very permissive licenses for all of our third-party dependencies if we can. It just makes our life a little bit easier when it comes to enforcement, at least. The other thing that we do is we default, essentially when we open things, we default immediately to GitHub. It's just where folks develop these days. It actually works pretty well, so I don't really have too many complaints about GitHub, a sense, except like the irony of like a bunch of open source projects kind of depending on this, non kind of open source service, and where issues and other things that are like kind of not easy to extract.
We noticed that.
Yeah. I actually have like one of my nightmares is like me getting a call like GitHub just like shutting down, and I'm like, oh man, that's gonna be a bad few weeks for me. So, but it's actually a problem we have in industry right now. So I mean, there are some other solutions out there, like the GitLab stuff is doing pretty well, which essentially is trying to clone GitHub. But but by default, if you're gonna like open source something, like it almost like there's a lot of people on GitHub, and people actually do contribute to your stuff there. So a lot of people ask us kind of like, what's your opinion on open source foundations and stuff like that. So we do love working with open source foundations. We use we sponsor Apache, we sponsor Linux Foundation, all that stuff, but we just don't prefer to start our projects there. We kind of have like a Darwinian view that you first start on GitHub, see if there's any traction. If there's anything that happens, then maybe consider going to a foundation. If not, hey, just kind of leave it on GitHub. And we've actually had quite a few cases where this happened. Like we did a kind of a collaboration with Cloudera for a columnar format for Hadoop, right? And the project was pretty successful after a year, and then we started to get larger companies to come and want to actually contribute and use us more. And one of the quotes that came along is about this is we don't use like toy GitHub projects type things, right? Like this large company said. So one of the funny kind of quotes internally, if you're ever doing like an Apache Foundation proposal, like there's like this little section that says like fascination with the Apache brand, right? It's like technically we don't have a fascination, but a lot of our customers and clients of our software do. So you're kind of forced to go to a more independent place where they're willing to it's completely understandable. Like if you're kind of a large company and you want to depend on someone's software and they're kind of the full owner of it, I could understand people's view. And we've had this hit in other cases. Like we acquired a company, a piece of software came with that we open source Storm. Similar type case, large companies that will remain nameless right now. We're like, hey, we really want to contribute stuff and work with you, but we don't want to do it on GitHub. We want to do it, at some independent foundation, preferably like Apache or something like that. So it worked out, in the end. And what's funny about this is that they were actually withholding contributions. Like, hey, we have this awesome security stuff for Storm, but not gonna give it to you unless you move it somewhere. So it's a little bit ridiculous how some of these companies operate these days. I won't talk about Mesos, but that was essentially a project that we got from a university was doing a university research project on some really cool infrastructure software. We decided to move it to Apache to kind of grow the community, but there's no reason to talk about details of that. In terms of licensing, so we generally default to permissive licenses for all outbound software. Basically, the reason for this is it's really like the path of least resistance. There's not much enforcement you really have to do besides, attribution. Companies generally don't care when it comes to if your stuff's under the Apache or MIT VSD, that's fine. That's not something we have to worry about. As soon as you use some form of copyleft, whether it's weak or strong, copyleft, then there's slight hesitation of adoption. And so we just generally prefer not to deal with that and just go straight up permissive on pretty much everything we do. We generally default to Apache for the majority of our infrastructure projects. There's some nice things about patent retaliation and trademark stuff with Apache. For front end related stuff, we generally default to MIT. So generally we try to be cognizant of the community that we work with. So if we're working with Node uses MIT, we might as well use MIT if we do anything there. What's interesting is that this trend, I think copyleft is is going to have some like interesting, reckoning to deal with itself in the future, because a lot of folks are probably avoiding it for similar reasons that we do, just to not deal with enforcement and whatnot. If you saw this study by, I think it was the 451 group, who are basically trying to track like license trends over time, and definitely, the permissive ones have kind of got an uptick, where the kind of ones with copyleft have kind of leveled off, in my opinion. This was back in 2011. I don't know how things have changed. It would be good to kind of see how this is, but just from my personal experience, I generally see this trend everywhere around me, from like companies like Square and Stripe and other everyone's releasing stuff under permissive based licenses these days. One of my favorite quotes about this kind of like whole attitude, which kind of reflects kind of our opinion, my opinion, is from Anti-Rez, who, I don't know if you guys know, he's the Redis guy. So his whole thing is, his philosophy is, open source for me is not a way to contribute to the free software movement, but to contribute to humanity. So for him, this means a lot of things. Like, he doesn't really care what people do with his code, nor if they release modifications back. He simply just wants people to use his code in one way or another. So, and he kind of has a philosophy of, he wants people to learn, new stuff and just play with it. He doesn't necessarily want to make money out of something. I kind of liked how he put it, like, something I wrote is not something that I lost, it's something that I've gained. And it's kind of a fun way to look at things. And he kind of has some more, quotes on this that, basically based on his kind of policy, is that he chooses a very permissive license like BSD for stuff based on that. So another thing that we kind of do that is a little bit unique for Twitter is, so we do a lot of M&A related activities, and a lot of it comes, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of acqui-hiring. So hey, getting a bunch of small group of people, mostly for engineering talent to help out. One thing that we're able to do is basically include open sourcing any software that is potentially acquired, as part of these discussions. So I think this is awesome, because a lot of times we acquire people because they actually develop some cool stuff. Traditionally in industry, a lot of people just shut it down, right? And so I thought we could do a little bit better on that. And so we've had a couple of cases where we acquired Moxie's company. I don't know if you're familiar with Moxie, but he developed like Redphone and some of that cool stuff. So as part of the deal, we agreed to open source, Redphone out there. And for Redphone's case, we actually did use a GPL. But it's surprising now that Moxie's no longer at Twitter, but he kind of has this whole open Whisper system company, and he's kind of just building a community around this type of software. So it's awesome. I think it was a huge win that we were able to do this. It would have been a huge waste if we weren't able to do this, in my opinion.
Is that something that you drive, or is it something that the talent that's being acquired drives, or both?
It's a mix of both. Some people don't care that, and some do. But it's something specifically that we basically, the open source office wanted to include as part of discussions. And it's a lot of time people are kind of excited that that's even an option. Some folks don't even like holy crap, I didn't even know that was on the table. And some folks may also have the attitude of if we get picked up, I don't want to deal with my kind of old stuff. I want to just jump in immediately on the new stuff. So in the case of we acquired a very small group of folks. They were called Clutch.io, and they did mobile A/B testing. And essentially, they actually had some existing paying customers, right? And part of the acquisition, the service was eventually going to be shut down. We opened up pretty much everything. One of their competitors essentially picked up the software and built a migration tool easily to migrate them to, their old stuff to this new stuff. So you have all these fun little benefits. I think if you acquire the right attitudes, and I think I would hope that more companies kind of treat acquisitions this way, but you could hope. The final thing, or actually the two final things that we do is Twitter has a very data-minded view of the world, so we measure the hell out of all of our open source projects. So it's critical for us to do this because we're able to kind of easily see from a compliance point of view, like sometimes if you have if you're able to see the most contentious issue for the past week, right? If there's an issue with 100 comments, right? There may be something crazy going on, or there may be not, right? So it's we essentially measure the crap out of everything and have fun reports that come out occasionally as part of it. Helps compliance. And kind of the last thing that we instilled in the office was kind of the notion of paying it forward. A lot of folks at the company realized that we wouldn't be where we are today without kind of riding on the shoulders of the open source technology that we've used. So we do our best to give back financially to organizations that are kind of critical to Twitter, like Apache and Linux and so on. So it's I wish more companies did this. There's a lot of companies out there. I don't know, if you look at banks and financial institutions, they use tons of stuff, but do they give anything back? Not really. So hopefully that will change in the future. And so getting back to my point of defining kind of our culture, this was essentially kind of the first thing that was done at Twitter when the open source office was established. And this is kind of what we use as an open source moral compass to operate as a company. A lot of people kind of ask why do we do this? Besides it being the right thing to do in my personal opinion, the best talent out there are generally folks that have worked with open source. A lot of technologies that are using open source, you might as well hire the best people. It acts as a good way for retention. A lot of people like to work on open source software. There's also a double-edged sword too, because if you hire people that are really popular open source people, or they get really popular working on open source, people also like to hire them, so you kind of have to deal with that. But that's life. It's good for everyone. So let's talk a little bit about logistics. So so compliance is hugely important at Twitter. One thing that we do a little differently than a lot of companies, we separate out compliance activities into engineering. So essentially it's a function of engineering and not legal. The reason for this is we actually do have a cool kind of legal department that allows us to do this. They put a lot of trust in us, but anytime you kind of get engineers and lawyers involved, it's generally not fun. I don't remember the last time it was fun. So we treat compliance as an engineering problem and kind of build tools to deal with it. So our contribution policy. So what do we allow our engineers to do as a company? So I don't know if you guys are familiar. In the U.S. at least, a lot of employee contracts kind of have ridiculous terms about any idea or anything related to your work. I think I pulled a little quote up there, but I put it in strike through. But anything that you've done, on employee time, or the duration of your employment, could potentially be owned by, your employer. We still, it's still definitely, in the contract that people sign at Twitter, but we kind of have a policy that if you want to contribute to any open source project, you're generally allowed to. We have a whitelist, essentially, of projects that and foundations people can contribute to. If it's something that we haven't contributed to before, or requires some legal CLA stuff, or maybe there's competitive issues, we just ask folks to come to the open source office and ask if it's okay. Other than that, it's totally supported. I don't know if you guys saw. I think yesterday there was a thread from Rackspace, which had a very interesting post that they basically publicized their kind of policy for contributions, right? Or for open source contributions for employees. They pretty much have said that by default they're basically allowing everyone essentially to contribute wherever they want, and actually give them the copyright to their contributions, which is a little bit interesting in my opinion. I don't think I've ever seen that done. I don't know if that's indicative of a trend yet.
So you actually allow the engineers to make a judgment call as to whether there are competitive issues or not?
Honestly, for the past, since we've had this policy in the beginning, we've had nothing has come up, that would cause us to worry. The trust that we've put in has worked so far. Is there a chance for failure potentially? Yes, but I think trusting your folks to do the right thing, coupled with.
I wasn't actually thinking about it from a lack of trust point of view.
Oh.
If you've got 1,000 engineers in the
Yeah.
company, they don't know everything that's going on in the company and what the future plans are.
Yeah.
So they could choose to go right and contribute something that is in fact competitive without even being aware of it.
Yeah. So there's two ways we kind of deal with that. One is just basic education, mandatory, kind of open source related education based on our policies, and number two, as kind of a service provider, there's, it depends. The definition of competition could be interesting, right?
Sure.
So in the end, we like this approach versus becoming a gatekeeper for everything. So we prefer to have contributions flow more than being a gatekeeper. It drives people insane otherwise. So. Sorry.
Are these contributions go out under Twitter copyright or?
Yes. So the policy is, if typical company policy, if it's done based on company resources or company time, Twitter owns the copyright. If you use your own if you do it off hours and off hardware, generally you're allowed to keep the copyright. Our policy is if you have any doubts, just come to us, and they do, and it works out pretty well that way. So I think it's a more humane way of doing it. At least engineers appreciate it. For outbound licensing, like I mentioned a little bit before, we default to the Apache for pretty much everything. Basically, the policy here is just be compatible and respected to the community that you're working with. Clojure guys, I don't know, they love the Eclipse public license for some reason. Node guys, MIT, so Linux GPL, of course. So that's generally how how we operate for anything that we produce ourselves. Generally, it goes with an Apache license. For inbound licenses, I'm sure, like you guys could predict, for a service provider, the AGPL is definitely somewhat of an interesting issue. So we generally avoid that. In practice, it's not too bad because the amount of AGPL software out there, surprisingly, is not that much. So I don't think it's seen a lot of adoption. But we also avoid the GPL too, mostly to not deal with the issue. Like if we bring some bit of GPL and then we go open source a potential library that depended on this, that infects our license choice potentially for that library. And also we do have to worry we do have mobile apps. So we have Twitter for Android, Twitter for iOS, Vine for Android, and there you could potentially have an issue, and we don't want to at least open source the code for those mobile apps at the moment. So we have to be careful of that. So to kind of deal with this process, we have basically we don't use tools like Black Duck or anything like that. We kind of have a homegrown licensing scanning tool that works pretty well. It catches, for us, since we're not. There's two things there's kind of two reasons why this works is we kind of have scrutiny at our distribution points. So basically, anywhere where we actually distribute software with it's like Twitter for iOS or Twitter for Android, there's a lot of eyeballs and tools for that problem. Stuff that is not distributed, there's a little bit more leniency on. And the other thing that we do that I don't see many companies doing is we actually embed lawyers with product teams. So if you're the Twitter mobile for iOS team will actually have a lawyer kind of there as part of the team to make sure things don't get messed up. So it works out. They're good people. So and that's essentially how it works. And then we kind of just have a whitelist of kind of approved licenses and banned licenses for people consuming software. That's it. Pretty straightforward. So from the perspective of an engineer, if you actually want to open some software, you just have yeah. Oh,
Just a
sorry.
quick question. Is the philosophy about licensing that you've discussed, is there pretty much consensus across the company about that? Or are there any disagreements?
I would say the majority of the company, I think there's some consensus, but there's definitely we definitely have people that have different viewpoints on it, and we have discussion on the inside occasionally about it. So I mean, we could talk a little bit about that after the talk, but yeah, there's some interesting projects that people have an opinion on. So like from the perspective of an engineer at Twitter, if you want to open up something, it's just like a straightforward process. Like we're a Jira shop, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. So we have to integrate with Jira. So we basically, if people want to open up something, they open up a Jira, point to a Git repo, and we kind of have a tool that goes and scans things to make sure that the code meets certain quality standards. Or is it? I think yeah. So like we basically automatically check for like license files and some other crazy stuff as part of the open source process.
Was there another question after the question?
Yeah, I can
sure.
wait till end.
Okay, sure. I mean, you could ask now. Like, it's fine.
It'll disrupt your flow. Fine.
I have a flow. That's so haphazard. I was like, I'm like jet lagged. That's my flow right now.
Go with it.
So, like I mentioned, we just kind of take an automated approach here to kind of make sure what we open kind of meets a minimum quality bar, and also it's kind of sane and with dependencies and all that stuff. So for inbound stuff, we used to have. I mean, we do have a CLA still, kind of modeled after the Apache one, but we've been slowly using it like less and less for projects. It's our kind of view of this is that it becomes somewhat of a barrier to contribution. A lot of people, don't like signing them and complain, and like we've made it like as easy as possible. Like I mean, like for Twitter CLA, I think you just have to log into Twitter and just like sign it. Like it like even fills out your name for you. It's just ridiculous. Just hit the button and add some stuff, but people still have an issue with it, and engineers hate checking if a CLA is signed. It's not like beautifully integrated with GitHub like Travis CR or something like, hey, CLA is signed, but it would be nice. But so our philosophy is like I don't know. In the future, I don't know if we're actually gonna have a CLA around for many of our stuff. So I don't see there's not. I mean, there's definitely good reason to have them, but we I think we're comfortable with the level of risk. A lot of people ask us about patents, so some disclosure is that like I really hate patents, but Twitter definitely is not not the largest fan either. One of the things that we kind of interestingly did, one of our lawyers and some of the folks on the inside worked on something called the Innovators Patent Agreement. So we had a lot of engineers that if you worked at a company before, like IBM or whatnot, and you kind of have a really strong taste of patents, you don't want to like patent anything anymore, right? And so as a way to kind of like encourage our engineers and to potentially patent ideas that would help protect a company, because if you're aware of how the patent kind of industry is structured, there's in a previous talk, you learn that there's trolls everywhere. Like, if you're a small company and a small competitor, like you're like, all right, you're kind of doing okay as a company, or like, oh hey, you become like, hey, you're doing well enough, you became a public company, and then like all the trolls come at your door, like unbelievable, right? So the best way to defend against that is sometimes having a patent portfolio of yourself, and kind of a way to encourage that is we came up with the Innovators Patent Agreement, which basically is an agreement between Twitter and our engineers that patents will only be used for defensive purposes, and you as an owner of the patent have veto rights for basically any usage of it. And this goes even if the patent is sold to another company for who knows what reason in the future. So it's a unique way of kind of dealing with the problem. I wish patents didn't really exist, but that's not gonna happen anytime soon. But Some other companies have kind of adopted this approach, but you know, not everyone. So there are other companies out there like Red Hat that take good defensive stances on things, but you know, I don't know how else to solve this problem. So it works for us. And kind of like the last thing is, you know, another thing that we do to kind of encourage our engineers to kind of do the right thing and also have an idea of what's going on with our open source you know, ecosystem. We have stats for everything, so it's kind of fun to kind of see you know, who's working on what, who's the most active this week, what's the most contentious issue, which projects haven't been touched in like a year, like maybe those should be like culled or archived or something. So kind of last couple things are some kind of like lessons learned / war stories from the office. So one of my biggest mistakes I think I've made was when we open source Bootstrap. You know, we chose the Apache public license, right? Like, kind of made sense to me at that time. At least seemed reasonable. Some dude comes up, you know, and is like, hey, you know, Bootstrap guys, I really want to use Bootstrap within a Drupal community, but you know, in Drupal land, you know, there's, you know, technically, you know, the APL v2 and the GPL v2 you know, are not compatible, right? At least in the Drupal sense of the terms, they're not allowed to have a Drupal module that uses Bootstrap, right? And so we're like, you know, okay, that's kind of reasonable. Like, let's see what it would take to migrate, right? You know, at that time, like, Bootstrap had, I think, like 200 contributors, and going back and asking 200 contributors if we could like relicense their stuff to MIT was kind of like the worst thing ever. It took like, I think it took about a year and a half. We finally actually got it done less than a month ago. So, so in this case, man, I don't even know. Like, this was just painful. I just wanted to talk about it. So, you know, our mistake was in front-end land, a lot of people are preferring the MIT license, and for reasons I wasn't aware, at least, a lot of kind of systems like WordPress, Joomla, and Drupal are under the GPL v2, and some communities care about this. I think Joomla didn't give a shit, and they just rolled with it. But you know, lesson here is, you know, it's just be cognizant of communities out there that you know, may, you know, your stuff may be consumed by, and your license choice definitely has an impact on that in the future. Another one, this was fun too, that came by. So we have a lot of caching, you know, I mean, we're huge users of like Memcache, Redis, and all that stuff. So a long time ago, we forked Memcached, right? We got cute and we called it Twemcache. So the problem with this is we were on, we tried to work with Upstream, but at the time they were just not being responsive. I don't know why. So we just went off and we did our fork. We made an announcement that like, hey, we're opening Twemcache, like, you know, it's based off an old fork of Memcached. You know, what happened is they got super angry with us. Like, they were not too pleased that we did this. Like, why did you work with Upstream? Like, you know, if you use a newer version of Memcache, like, a lot of this stuff is already fixed. And so there was a lot of strife that happened, you know, due to this. You know, I consider this somewhat my fault, and also somewhat, you know, not reaching out to Upstream and being like, hey, like, this is kind of what we're planning to do. So it was a huge surprise. Like, if you're going to open source a very large fork of something, you should actually reach out to the respective community and give them at least a heads up and why you're doing this. And that's something we didn't do. Another thing that happened in our open source office was kind of an act of, like, I guess, misconduct. So initially we're just like a couple hundred engineers, and we grew to like 1,000+ engineers now. And so there's always bound to be like a little flame war or something that erupts. And in this case, it was hilarious because it was like category theory and math nerd stuff. And so it's like someone reported an issue, and it was basically like, what is the definition of like a bijection, right? And like we have a library called bijection, and like technically, you know, you could argue that, you know, it doesn't meet the technical terms of what a bijection is. And so one of our engineers started getting like snippy and he was complaining about like help everything there is overflow. So like it just like reflected bad on us. And what eventually happened was like he was like, well, I had no idea how I should act in open source. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, be nice, right? Like, but so lesson here was like, well, we should probably have a code of conduct for our folks on how to operate in the open. And that's what eventually did, like through some of the great work that like the Ubuntu community has done and Mozilla and some other folks, we just created a code of conduct based off that and tweaked it to our needs. And now there's no question of how you should, act, in the open. So
were these like employees posting on a public forum and
it was like,
as their role on Twitter?
Oh yeah, so this was straight on GitHub. So some person like looks at our library and they're like, oh yeah, this is great, but this is technically not what what bijection is in code. And then one of our employees is like, okay, you're an idiot, and essentially and argues, and it went on like I linked to the thread, but it went on for a while, and so it just reflects poorly. And just out of the discussion was like I didn't know how to like act, and I was like, okay, like maybe we should have a code of conduct. And yeah, it's young people sometimes. So we had some other worse ones, but I left those out. So I think so. At the end of the day, I just kind of want to leave you with like this is kind of how we operate. This kind of works for us. We're essentially we're a service provider company that provides a useful service, hopefully to folks out there. We consume a lot of, open source software, but if you kind of look out at some like other modern, I don't know, like modern is the right word, but other companies out there, they, that especially as service providers, they are operating in a very similar fashion, in my opinion. And I think you'll continue to see this type of trend for companies that are essentially monetizing via via data collection or advertising or some other type of service. So other than that, like I really hope you guys learned something new. So sorry if I'm like a little under the weather. Jet lag's kind of hitting me, but there's no like coffee, but it's cold. So I'll leave it to you guys to answer or ask any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. And man, I misspelled open source. I lose. Okay. Hey, okay. You got a question?
Yeah. So your first point was use open.
Yes.
So basically, you tell your engineers, no need to reinvent everything. You can use.
Yeah.
If it's out there.
First scour the internet. First scour the internet, GitHub, whatever, for something out there before trying to write your own. And if you find like if you're gonna write, like in our case, because this has happened, if you're gonna write your own distributed key value store, you really prove that this is worthwhile long term and benchmark against what's out there. And
so my question is, do you also look at proprietary solutions?
At times, yeah. Yep.
So it's not only open. Use what's over there.
So it's like default open if you can. So
Yeah.
essentially is probably the better way of thinking out. So there are some like proprietary solutions, used for Vertica, like use some Vertica, but the long-term goal is to, edge towards open solutions. I don't have to like sell you on the open source arguments. Like you have control, you could patch stuff.
Yeah.
Like yeah. So yes, question back there. Hey, how's it going?
Employee undertaking in relation to patent inventions created by your employees.
Yes, the Innovators Patent Agreement.
So does that undertaking exist even when they move out of Twitter?
Yes. So as part of the deal, it travels with them. So
Sorry.
even if the patents are at Twitter or sold to another company.
No, it's not so much whether it's sold to other companies, the patent itself.
Yeah.
But what if the employee goes to another company?
They still have the rights to. Yeah.
The nature of negotiations and sales, when in effect you're not really selling an unencumbered property.
So say that again. So
In
I
other
know.
words, the sale of the patent is not really a free sale because it's encumbered by an undertaking to somebody who could move to a competitor.
I mean, so Twitter stance, like we're not in a bit like, we have to deal with the system in like, we can't ignore patents, right? Because we get, people try to sue us. So we try to best to mold the system into the way we want to. And, the IPA was one way to encourage engineers to actually patent anything versus nothing. So it's what we have. I don't know if that best answers your question, but yes. Yeah. I mean, they're pretty crappy, like,
Could you repeat
scripts.
the question?
Yeah, okay, so it's like, we have homegrown licensing scanning tools. Is there any chance of you open sourcing them? We could, but they're just like pretty crappy scripts. Like, nothing super fancy. I guess, I mean, it could be useful, but we're just checking for license headers and GPL and other type things. So it's really nothing. It's really nothing fancy. Yeah. I mean, it was quicker to write on our own than finding something. Actually, we didn't know anything existed out there, so that's probably why we wrote something on our own, and we didn't want to pay for Black Duck or anything like that. So it's simply like license scanning, code scanning. Like, we scan all this. It's not fancy enough to like detect that someone copied and pasted a source in there. Like, that's just the level of risk that we live with. We're looking for licensing and hoping license information comes along. Yeah, potentially, but I'm not familiar enough with Fosology how it works. But I'm sure it's probably a bunch of scripts that scans for license editors, and like, I don't know how else you do it. So. Yes, you have a question?
Follow up and say you probably should have the people who built that go look at whether they can take any of their experience and put it in Fosology. It's really a good tool.
Okay, it was me, so I could
It's quite nice.
Okay, it's probably a similar concept. Like, it's a pain point that anyone hits that deals with compliance.
It manages the database of all the things you've scanned and generates reports, and
Okay.
it's a very nice system.
Okay, awesome. Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
So you mentioned Clojure. Do you actually use Clojure at all?
We acquired a company. Part of the libraries were Clojure based. I think we had Cascalog and some other stuff, but we don't, like, it's not used that much. Like, not much as far as I know. Like, the majority of Twitter these days is a combination of Scala and Java code.
So you wouldn't have really had an opportunity to think about challenges in combining the EPL with other licenses?
No.
Okay.
So
Okay.
we haven't contributed much back, at least from my knowledge. We haven't contributed much back besides what we acquired from Backtype, which was a company, and pretty much just opened up what they had, and which some of it was Clojure based. I think Cascalog and all that stuff.
I've got another question.
Yeah.
If nobody else has a question. So you said a couple of times in your talk that you default to permissive.
Yeah.
Do you ever choose copyleft licenses?
We haven't. I mean, if we're forced, like if we contribute patches to the kernel, right? Like, obviously, it's gonna be.
Do you contribute
Yeah.
not just to the kernel?
Yeah.
So you run, like, the whole farm is on Linux?
Yeah, it's all running on Linux.
So, okay. And, I didn't realize you guys were contributing back to the kernel.
Yeah, we have
Cool.
a few people that contribute back. So
Okay.
there's a whole other thread on like, it's,
So I'm teasing you a little bit about the choice of the word default. I mean, if you're creating original projects.
if we're creating original projects, we default to.
No, but it's not a default. It's a hard rule, right? You must use a permissive license.
Well, it's actually internally it's not a must. It's like what we actually default to. Like, engineers have an option to use whatever. Like, they are able to use another license if they want to. They just have to say why. They have to defend their choice.
Okay. Oh, that's good. And one last question is, you talked about inbound CLAs, but how do you handle the case of outbound CLAs where, other projects might require a CLA for you to push upstream things?
It's a case-by-case basis. Like, we generally, if they're Apache style, we generally don't, we're okay with it. Like, but we've actually contributed stuff to like say like Facebook, right? And like they use an Apache style CLA, and it's okay. It just goes through a legal process.
Since you use Java, would you sign the Oracle contributor?
We have.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
We actually are going to start contributing to OpenGDK. So
Cool.
it works. All right. So thank you guys. Sorry for taking so long.